A journey into ancient lore begins with a gentle exploration of Hellenic legends and subtle historical fragments, almost erased from the memory of centuries. These are tales whispered from marble halls, passed down by shepherds under shimmering starry skies and carried from generation to generation by those capable of dreaming. To fully immerse oneself in these stories, it is recommended to dim the lights and settle in comfortably, allowing the day's clamour to dissipate like mist over the Aegean Sea. The journey to ancient Greece, where even mighty gods sometimes required peaceful night's sleep, now commences. To create the perfect ambience, you might consider some soft background noise to transport you to those distant times. Many are familiar with the story of Pandora's box, that legendary vessel said to have released all evils into the world when curiosity overcame the first woman of humanity. Today, however, we invite you to slow the narrative and delve deeply into the private moments that preceded those irreversible changes. Imagine a modest stone house nestled among hills that would one day become the majestic surroundings of Athens. Morning light filtering through wooden shutters painted soft, dancing patterns on the clay walls. Pandora sat at her simple wooden table, her fingers tracing the smooth bronze surface of the box, from which a faint hum seemed to emanate, an energy she couldn't quite comprehend. For 3 days her gaze had been fixed on this object. 3 long, silent days of agonizing deliberation. The gods had presented it to her as a wedding gift, or so they claimed. Zeus himself, with his customary smile, had placed the box in her hands, accompanying it with a warning that felt more like a dare. Never open it, dear Pandora. Promise me you never will. But what ancient chronicles often overlook about those agonizing days of waiting is this. Pandora struggled not only with overwhelming curiosity, she was tormented by profound loneliness. Her husband, Epimetheus, toiled in the olive groves from dawn till dusk, his hands growing rough and dark from constant work with branches and earth. Returning home, he was too exhausted for long conversations. He would eat his bread and olives, perhaps exchange a few words about the weather or a neighbour's goat, and then fall asleep to the incessant chirping of crickets in the garden. They were only just learning to live together, and in that silence, Pandora was left alone with the box. She ran her fingers over its intricate engravings, spirals that seemed to twist when she wasn't looking directly at them, faces of unknown creatures, symbols that felt familiar, yet she was certain she'd never seen before. Sometimes, late at night, when Epimetheus snored softly on their humble bed, she imagined she heard something inside the box. Not quite voices, but something like a whisper, like the rustle of wind in leaves, the gurgle of water over stones, or perhaps the distant laughter of children playing a long-forgotten game. The morning of the 4th day brought a shift. Pandora awoke before dawn, as was often her habit, and went to the small window overlooking the valley. The world was enveloped in that particular stillness that precedes birdsong, when everything seems possible and nothing has yet disturbed the harmony. She prepared her simple breakfast, bread Epimetheus traded for in the village, honey from the neighbours' bees, water from the spring behind their home. But as she ate, her gaze kept returning to the box. Today it looked different. The bronze seemed warmer, almost alive, and the whispers she had previously dismissed as imagination were now distinct, soft, but perfectly clear. We know. You're listening. they seemed to say. "We know you understand." Pandora set aside her bread and slowly approached the table where the box waited. "What do you want?" she whispered, feeling a little foolish talking to an inanimate object, yet intuitively understanding it was the right thing to do. The answer came not in words, but in images forming in her mind. She saw herself as the gods had made her, moulded from clay and water, endowed with breath and consciousness, blessed with gifts from each of the immortals. Athena had given her wisdom, Aphrodite had granted her beauty, Hermes had bestowed curiosity and the power of persuasive speech. But what none of the stories ever mentioned was that Hera had given her the ability to sense when something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. And standing there in her small kitchen as the first rays of morning light began to creep across the floor, Pandora suddenly realized the box was not full of evils eager to escape. It was full of truths that someone did not want the world to know. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small bronze clasp that held the lid shut. It was not from fear, but from the weight of sudden understanding. The gods had given her this box not as a test of obedience. They had given it to her because they knew only she was brave enough to open it when the time was right. The clasp was warm beneath her fingers, almost alive. As she began to lift it, she heard Epimetheus stirring in the bedroom, likely waking to another day of simple, honest work in the groves. She paused for a moment, contemplating the life they led. Quiet, peaceful, untroubled by the complexities that seemed to plague the gods and their endless dramas. A part of her wished to put the box away, to pretend she had never heard the whispers, to spend her days learning to bake better bread and tend her garden. But the whispers grew stronger, and now she could discern individual voices. They were not evil at all. They were sad, lonely. They had been trapped for so long, bearing truths that were meant to be shared. One voice in particular caught her attention, softer than the others, yet somehow more insistent. "I am hope," it said, "and I have been waiting for you, Pandora. The world will need me most of all." It was then that she understood everything. The box did not contain evil. It contained everything that makes life authentic. Pain and loss, yes, but also courage and hope, and the kind of love that grows stronger when tested. The gods had kept these things locked away because they wished for humans to remain simple and obedient, never venturing beyond what their creators had planned. But humans were meant to grow. They were meant to face challenges and learn from them, to experience sorrow and discover resilience, to confront injustice and choose to strive for something better. Now, with steady hands, Pandora opened the box. What emerged was not a storm of chaos, but something far more subtle, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. The whispers transformed into a gentle breeze that carried seeds of possibility throughout the world. Some, yes, would turn into challenges, but others would blossom into innovation, art, philosophy, and deeper kinds of love than the gods could ever have imagined. Epimetheus found her there an hour later, sitting peacefully at the table with the empty box before her. "Did you?" he began, but she smiled and nodded. "I did what I was made to do," she simply said. And as they sat together, watching the sun rise higher over their valley, they both noticed something new in the morning light. It seemed somehow brighter, full of possibilities they had never considered before. Later that day they heard news from the village that made them smile. A young potter had discovered a new technique for making stronger clay vessels. A shepherd had figured out how to help his flock find better pasture. Two families who had been feuding for years suddenly decided to work together on a project that would benefit everyone. The box had been full of potential, and now that potential was loose in the world, finding its way to anyone willing to embrace both the challenges and the opportunities that come with true life. But here is the part of the story that often gets lost in all the retellings. Pandora never regretted opening that box, not even as she grew old and saw the world become more complex. As she saw people struggle with problems their simple ancestors never had to face, because she also saw them solve problems, create beauty, love more deeply, and dream of a future their ancestors could never have imagined. And late at night, when she was very old, and the box sat empty on her table like an old friend, she could still hear the voice of hope, whispering on the wind that rustled through her olive trees, reminding her that no matter how dark things seemed somewhere in the world, someone was always ready to light a candle and keep going. As you drift deeper into thought tonight, perhaps you too will hear that whisper. Hope is still moving through the world, still finding its way to whoever needs it most. This whisper of hope, which accompanied Pandora throughout her long life, reached a simple farmer named Alexios generations later. He lived in the rocky hills below Delphi, where the most famous oracle in ancient Greece delivered prophecies to kings and common folk alike. But Alexios never approached the oracle with questions. Instead, he did something far more unusual. He made sure she had something to eat. Every morning, as the first light touched the peaks of Mount Parnassus, Alexios loaded his small wooden cart with fresh bread, goat cheese, olives from his 3 ancient trees, and any vegetables his stony patch of land could produce. The climb to the temple of Apollo was steep and winding, but he had made the journey for 17 years, ever since he first saw the Pythia, the woman who served as Apollo's voice, looking thin and pale after an especially strenuous day of prophecy. Most people, when they imagine the oracle at Delphi, picture a mysterious, almost otherworldly figure, uttering prophecies in cryptic riddles, perched above sacred mists. Alexios, however, possessed a knowledge unavailable to pilgrims or royalty. The Pythia, it turned out, was an ordinary woman named Clio, who, after delivering divine messages, suffered from unbearable headaches, and often forgot to eat for days. The first time Alexios brought her food, she looked at him with astonishment. Perhaps relief. "Why?" she whispered, her voice still weak from the morning's prophecy. "Because even oracles need breakfast," he simply replied, carefully placing a basket filled with warm bread and fresh cheese. This marked the beginning of their unusual friendship, if one could call it that, with one person speaking mostly divine pronouncements, and the other mostly discussing crop rotation and whether the neighbour's goats had once again gotten into his gardens. That morning, as Alexios guided his cart along the familiar path, he reflected on Clio's words from the day before. A wealthy merchant from Corinth had come to Delphi seeking advice, pondering whether to invest in a new trade route. And after inhaling the sacred vapours and entering her prophetic trance, the Pythia had declared, "The path that seems most golden will turn to dust, but the road built of small stones will safely lead you home." The merchant had frowned, demanding a clearer explanation, but Clio by then had returned. To her ordinary state, rubbing her temples in a characteristic gesture that foreshadowed another headache. So Alexios silently left his usual offering, bread, cheese, a handful of early figs, and went home, wondering what Apollo had truly meant. Now, delivering his morning fare, he found Clio sitting by the temple in the morning sun, looking unusually thoughtful. "Good morning," he said, unpacking his basket. "You look as if you've been wrestling with the gods all night," she smiled, accepting the bread he offered. "Not with the gods, but just trying to understand what they want people to hear." This was quite unusual. Normally, Clio remembered little of what she said during her prophetic trances. The messages passed through her rather than coming from her, and afterward she felt hollow and confused, like someone who had spoken a language they didn't truly know. "About yesterday's prophecy?" Alexios asked, settling beside her on the temple steps. Clio nodded slowly, breaking off. A piece of bread and eating it with the careful attention of someone who had forgotten to eat too many times. The merchant asked about profit and trade routes, but it came out as something about building something lasting instead of chasing something shiny. Alexios considered this, watching the sun rise higher over the valley below. From where they sat, he could see his small farm, just a few terraced plots carved into the hillside. His humble home with its red tile roof, the stone walls he'd built with his own hands to keep his goats from wandering. "Perhaps," he said at last, the god was telling him that true wealth comes from doing something useful every day, not from seeking one big success. Clio looked at him with interest. "You think that's what Apollo meant?" "I think Apollo speaks through you to tell people what they need to hear, not always what they want to hear." And perhaps what that merchant needed to hear was that getting rich quickly usually means someone else gets poor quickly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, eating their bread and watching the world awaken below. A shepherd led his flock to pasture, following the same path his father and grandfather had taken. Smoke rose from cooking fires in the village, where people began their daily tasks, baking bread, feeding animals, greeting neighbors, starting another day of the small but important work that sustains communities. After a while, Clio spoke. "You know, I've been thinking. You've brought me food for 17 years, every morning, no matter the weather, and you've never once asked me for a prophecy, never sought to know your future or asked for advice on your troubles." "It never seemed necessary," Alexios replied. "I see my future quite clearly, as I do my past. Mostly I'll plant seeds, tend them, mend what breaks, help my neighbors when they need it, perhaps find a wife someday, perhaps not. Either way, there will be work and people to feed. But don't you want to know if your crops will fail, or if you'll find love, or how long you'll live?" Alexios considered this seriously. "If I knew my crops would fail, I would worry about it every day until it happened. If I knew they would succeed, I might grow lazy and not tend them properly. If I knew when I would die, I would spend all my time until then worrying about it, instead of just living." He paused, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "But I do know one thing for certain." "What is that?" "Tomorrow morning you will be hungry again, and I will be here with breakfast." Clio laughed, the sound of pure delight echoing off the temple walls. That is perhaps the most accurate prophecy made in Delphi in many years. As if summoned by their laughter, a young woman appeared on the path below, climbing towards the temple with the determined gait of someone carrying a heavy burden. Even from a distance they could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she constantly paused to look back, as if pursued by troubles she couldn't outrun. "Another seeker," Cleo murmured, automatically shifting into her professional demeanor, but Alexios observed the woman more closely. "Look at her sandals," he said, "worn at the heels, and that cloak, once of good quality, but mended in several places. She has travelled far and spent most of her money to get here." When the woman finally reached the temple, she was breathing heavily, trying not to show how exhausted she was. She approached Cleo with the formal gestures of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. "Oracle of Apollo," she began, "I seek guidance." But Alexios stood and offered her his seat on the steps. "Sit first," he said gently. "Rest a while. Have some bread and water." The woman looked surprised, but gratefully accepted both the seat and the food. As she ate, her story emerged in pieces. Her name was Thalia. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with 3 small children and debts she could not repay. She had sold almost everything she owned and walked for 12 days to reach Delphi, hoping for divine guidance on whether she should remarry a man who could provide for her family, but whom she did not love, or try to manage on her own, despite all the difficulties. When she finished speaking, Cleo prepared to enter the temple and consult the sacred vapors. But before she could rise, Alexios spoke. "Before you ask the god," he said to Thalia, "perhaps I could ask you something. What did you do before your husband died? What were you good at?" Thalia looked puzzled. I ran the household, raised the children, helped with the harvest. I baked good bread, and I know herbs, medicinal ones, culinary ones. People used to come to me for remedies when their children were ill." "And you walked here for 12 days? "Yes. So you are strong, determined, and skilled at planning a long journey. You know about herbs and healing. You can bake, and you've successfully raised 3 children while helping run a farm." Alexios looked at her seriously. "Thalia, you don't need a prophecy. You need a place where those skills are valued." He turned to Cleo. "How many pilgrims come here every day? 20, 30 more during festivals?" "And all of them need food, lodging, someone to tend to their travel-weary feet and soothe their anxious minds before they consult the oracle." Understanding dawned in Cleo's eyes. "Thalia, what if your answer isn't in choosing between 2 difficult paths, but in creating a third? What if you stay here in Delphi and open an inn for pilgrims? You could use all your skills, support your children, and build something entirely your own." Thalia looked at both of them. "I never thought of that, but I have no money to open an inn." "You have skills," Alexios said, "and this community needs what you have to offer. Start small, perhaps just offering bread and herbal teas to travelers. Let people know you are here, that you are reliable, that you care about their comfort. Build it stone by stone, day by day." Later, after Thalia had left to explore the village and consider this new possibility, Cleo turned to Alexios with wonder in her eyes. "That was better than any prophecy I could have given her." "Perhaps," Alexios said. "The best prophecy is simply helping people see what they already know, but were afraid to believe." The quiet wisdom of salt walls, the legacy of Alexios and Mera. As the dazzling sun reached its zenith, bathing the world in the warmth of midday heat, Alexios, the mountain dweller, prepared to descend to begin his daily duties. However, before he could depart, Cleo, with unexpected resolve, held his hand. "Alexios," she said, "in the 17 years we've known each other, you've never asked me for anything, yet I wish to give you a gift." For a moment she closed her eyes, not entering a prophetic trance, but rather listening to an inner voice that resonated deeper than the sacred vapors of Delphi. "Sometimes your harvests will be meager, and sometimes they will flourish. Such is the nature of farming. Perhaps you will find love, and perhaps not. Whatever fate may hold, you will live out your allotted time, and that will be quite enough. But this I know for certain. Every morning, when you choose to climb this hill, carrying food to a hungry person, you make the world a little more like the gods intended. And that, believe me, is a kind of immortality that no prophecy can surpass." As he descended the winding mountain path, Alexios, his empty cart bouncing familiarly over the stones, smiled inadvertently. Tomorrow morning he would rise even earlier, load his cart with freshly baked bread and whatever his garden had produced, and set off for Delphi again. He would do so not because a prophecy had been given to him, but because some kinds of certainty require no divine revelation. They require only a daily choice, and perhaps in this lies the most ordinary, yet most beautiful truth of all. The future is not created by grand gestures or mystical insights, but by the simple decision to show up tomorrow and do something useful for another person. This unassuming wisdom about the importance of daily presence, which guided Alexios on the mountain path to Delphi, found its way into the very foundations of Athens through a completely unexpected source. A 10-year-old girl named Mira, whose occupation involved collecting salt from tears. Not real tears, of course, though the story certainly begins with an abundance of them. Mira lived in those early days when Athens was just beginning its transformation from a mere cluster of dwellings grouped around a hill into something greater. Her father, Nicias, was a stonemason who worked on the great building projects that would one day make Athens famous. In those days, however, his work mainly consisted of repairing walls and laying foundations for humble homes. Salt, of course, came from the sea, but getting it into the city proved more challenging than one might expect. Mira's job, which she invented herself, was to go to the harbour every morning. There salt merchants unloaded their goods, and Mira would collect the salt crystals that had spilled from torn sacks or fallen through cracks in wooden crates. It was a humble task, one that adults often overlooked. However, Mira noticed something remarkable about salt. A small amount could preserve food for months. A pinch could make even stale bread more palatable, and when mixed with certain herbs her grandmother knew the secrets of, salt could clean wounds and prevent infection. More importantly, she noticed that buildings lasted longer in places where the salty spray of the ocean settled into the mortar between the stones. This observation might have remained merely a curious fact in the mind of a young girl, had it not been for an event that occurred during the Great Wall project, when she was 11 years old. Athens was growing, and with growth came a pressing need for better defences, not just against enemy armies, though that was a serious concern, but also against floods that occurred every few years, when winter rains swelled the rivers, and against earthquakes that sometimes toppled buildings. The city council commissioned a new section of the defensive wall, and Nicias was chosen as one of the lead stonemasons for this massive undertaking. He was proud of the appointment, but also anxious. The materials provided were good, but not exceptional. The stones were local limestone, soft enough to work, but prone to cracking. The mortar was a standard mix of lime, sand, and water. It would build a functional wall, but likely not one that would last for centuries. Mira watched the work closely and thought about those salt-reinforced stones in the harbour. One evening, as her father sat on their doorstep, cleaning mortar from his hands and lamenting that small cracks were already appearing in the day's work, she made a suggestion. What if we added salt to the mortar? Nicias looked at his daughter with the patient expression adults use when children suggest impossible things. Salt costs money, little mouse, and even if we could afford it, who knows if it would help or hurt. However, Mira had been saving the salt she collected for months, storing it in clay jars in her small pantry. She had enough to make a test batch of mortar, and she had an idea of how to prove its effectiveness. Behind their house was a low retaining wall that held up a small garden terrace. Nothing important, nothing that would matter if it fell. With her father's permission, she mixed a batch of salt mortar and repaired a section of this wall. Then she waited. The first test came with the autumn rains. The regular mortar in other parts of the wall softened and cracked where water collected, but Mira's salt mortar section remained firm and intact. The second test came with winter frosts, when ice formed in tiny crevices between stones. Again, the salt section held strong while traditional mortar cracked and crumbled. By spring, even the most skeptical stonemasons in the city were talking about the girl who had figured out how to make mortar that could withstand weather that destroyed everything else. But here is where the story takes a truly intriguing turn. Mira did not seek to profit personally from her discovery. Instead, she made a proposal to the city council that was so unusual they initially didn't know how to react. She suggested organizing the children of Athens to collect salt at the harbour in the same way she had been doing for years. Not just her, but dozens of other children who could earn a little money while contributing something meaningful to the entire city. The city, in turn, would buy this salt at fair prices. Not enough to make anyone rich, but enough for the children to feel the value of their labour. And instead of keeping the salt mortar technique a secret, she was willing to teach it to any stonemason who wished to learn. The council was puzzled. But why give away something so valuable? Asked Councillor Demetrius. You could charge premium prices for salt-fortified construction. Mira, now 12 and developing into a thoughtful young woman who chose her words carefully, stood before the assembled adults and explained her logic. If only the wealthy can afford buildings that last, then only the wealthy can build what matters. But if everyone knows how to make stronger mortar, then everything we build, walls, homes, workshops, temples, all become more permanent. The whole city becomes stronger. She paused, looking around the room at the men who made decisions for Athens. Also, I was thinking about time. My father says a good wall should last for his grandchildren to see. But what if we could build walls that lasted for our grandchildren's grandchildren? What if every person who built something in Athens knew they were contributing to something that would still be here centuries from now? The idea took hold slowly, as truly good ideas often do. At first, only a few stonemasons began experimenting with salt mortar on their projects. Then, word spread to other cities from which builders began to travel to Athens to learn this innovative technique. Within a few years, Athenian mortar became synonymous with durable and reliable construction. However, the real changes were not just in the physical strength of the buildings. They were in how people began to approach their work. When a person realizes that what they are building might last for centuries, they begin to pay attention to the smallest details that might otherwise be overlooked. They choose materials more carefully. They take more time to make precise measurements. They think about how weather and time will affect their creation. More importantly, they begin to think about the people who will use what they have built, long after they themselves are gone. Mira, now a grown woman, married to a potter named Lysander, often walked through the city and pointed out buildings constructed using her salt mortar technique. But she took particular pride in the smaller structures: neighborhood walls keeping children's play areas safe, market stalls sheltering elderly vendors, public fountains providing clean water for everyone. You see, she would tell her children, when you make good things available to everyone, the whole world becomes more beautiful. The salt walls of Athens became famous throughout Greece, not just for their exceptional strength, but for what they symbolized. This was a city where a child's observation was taken seriously, where innovation was shared, not hoarded, where every building project was seen as an invaluable gift to future generations. Visitors often asked to be shown the great salt walls, expecting to see some magnificent fortress or grand temple. But the Athenians would merely smile and point around them, at the sturdy homes, the reliable market buildings, the neighborhood walls that had withstood decades of storms and earthquakes. All of them, they would say. Every wall in Athens is now a salt wall. And late at night, as the city slept, you could almost hear the buildings themselves whispering their gratitude to the little girl who paid attention to spilled salt, to the stonemasons who were willing to learn from a child, to the community that chose longevity over immediate profit. The walls of Athens stand in many places even today, their salt-fortified mortar as strong now as it was centuries ago. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this quiet story, that somewhere right now, in the moonlight, those ancient stones continue to do their work, protecting and sheltering, built by people who understood that the most important work is that which lasts long after we are gone. This understanding of durable construction, deeply ingrained in the very fabric of Athens thanks to ancient wisdom, found its embodiment decades later in the most ambitious project ever conceived by the city. This refers to the temple that would later become known as the Parthenon, majestically rising on the Acropolis, dominating the city's skyline. However, our narrative focuses not on the celebrated architects or virtuoso sculptors whose skill endowed the Parthenon with its unique beauty. It is about a 9-year-old boy named Damon, whose job was to navigate spaces too confined. For adult workers, and who managed to notice what almost everyone else overlooked. Damon was one of the so-called gap boys, a few young workers whose agility allowed them to squeeze through narrow passages between the scaffolding, retrieve dropped tools, and inspect areas where adult men could not fit. This work was generally considered safe and provided enough income to help his widowed mother buy food and pay for a small apartment near the Agora. The boy genuinely loved his work, especially the climbing. Every morning he would ascend the wooden scaffolding that, like a dense forest of pine poles and ropes, embraced the growing temple, and spent the day moving through the construction labyrinth with the agility of a small, cautious spider. From this height, he had a view of the entire city of Athens spread out below, the red-tiled roofs of houses, the green patches where citizens cultivated gardens, and the distant harbour where ships arrived daily with marble from the islands, and timber from northern forests. However, more than the view itself, he valued the feeling of being part of something grand and eternal. Each marble block taking its place, each column reaching for the sky, each carved detail emerging under the sculptor's chisels, all became part of a creation destined to outlast everyone who labored on it. Damon had been working on the construction site for almost a year when a problem with the roof caught his attention. It was a nuance so subtle that it could only be noticed by spending entire days crawling across the upper levels of the scaffolding. The marble beams intended to support the roof were immaculate, perfectly carved, beautifully fitted, strong enough to bear the heavy tiles and the exquisite decorative elements that would complete the temple. However, they held one small flaw that could turn into a serious problem. Each beam was carved with a slight upward curve, an engineering solution designed to counteract the natural sagging of heavy stone over time. This was a display of exceptional craftsmanship, the very detail that distinguished outstanding builders from ordinary ones. But in the narrow drainage channels through which rainwater was meant to flow off the roof, this upward curve created tiny depressions where water would collect instead of draining freely. For most of the year this would not matter. Athens had a dry climate, and most rains came as short but intense downpours that quickly ran off any surface. But Damon had experienced several winter seasons when continuous heavy rains could last for days, and he knew perfectly well what happened to marble when water lingered in small cavities for too long. It slowly, imperceptibly at first, but inevitably, cracked. The problem was that no one else seemed to notice, and Damon was just a 9-year-old gap boy. The chief architect, Ictinus, was known throughout Greece for his unparalleled precision and skill. The project manager, Callicrates, had overseen the construction of dozens of significant structures. The marble carvers were true artists whose creations were meant to inspire awe for centuries. Who was he to suggest they might have made a mistake? For several days, Damon was tormented by this worry alone. He would climb to inspect the roof structure during his lunch breaks, tracing the channels meant to carry water with his small fingers, measuring the tiny depressions with pieces of string, trying to convince himself he was wrong. But the longer he studied the problem, the more convinced he became that these minor imperfections would eventually destroy the temple from above, much like termites slowly undermine a house from within. Finally, he decided to approach Phidias, the master sculptor who oversaw all the artistic elements of the building. Phidias was known for his patient demeanor with young workers, and had a reputation for listening to ideas that came from the most unexpected sources. Damon found the great artist resting in the shade of the scaffolding, sketching designs for one of the pediment sculptures that would crown the completed temple. It took all of Damon's courage to interrupt the master. "Master Phidias," he began, his voice softer than he expected. "May I show you something that troubles me?" Phidias looked up from his sketches with the kind expression of a man who genuinely loved to share knowledge. "Of course, young Damon, what troubles you?" Instead of trying to explain with words, Damon led the sculptor through the scaffolding to the roof level, where the marble support beams stretched across the width of the temple, like the ribs of some giant creature. "Look here," Damon said, pointing to one of the drainage channels. "When it rains, water will flow from the high point of the roof, but when it reaches these low spots, it won't keep going. It will just sit there." Phidias knelt beside the boy and ran his experienced fingers over the marble surface. After a moment, he pulled out a small bronze tool and allowed a few drops of water from his drinking cup to trickle down the channel. The water flowed smoothly at first, then collected exactly in the spots Damon had predicted. "How long have you noticed this?" Phidias asked, his voice now serious. "Several weeks. I kept hoping I was wrong, but every time I check, the water collects in the same places." Phidias was silent for a long time, looking at the city below, then back at the roof structure, which represented months of meticulous planning and costly labor. "Damon," he said at last, "I need you to show this to Master Ictinus right now." What followed was one of the most intense dialogues in the history of the Parthenon's construction. Ictinus, confronted with irrefutable evidence that his roof design contained a potentially catastrophic flaw, cycled through a range of emotions, from disbelief and anger to something that might have passed for panic, before settling into the focused determination of a master craftsman faced with a problem to solve. The solution they found was elegant but extremely costly. Every affected marble beam had to be removed, transported back to the carvers' workshops and recut, deepening the drainage channels so that water would flow freely past the low spots. This would add months to the construction schedule and require several highly skilled craftsmen to redo work they considered perfectly executed. However, the alternative, a temple slowly destroying itself from rainwater damage, was utterly unthinkable. When the rework began, Damon became something of a celebrity on the construction site. Workers who had barely noticed him before now sought his advice on their own small observations and concerns. But more importantly, the experience changed the very attitude towards the construction process. Ictinus instituted a new practice. Every week, workers of all levels, from master craftsmen to apprentice boys, would gather to discuss anything unusual or potentially problematic they had noticed. No observation was considered too insignificant to mention. No worker was too young to speak up. In this way, they discovered dozens of small improvements. A stonemason noticed that the morning sunlight revealed chisel marks invisible in the daylight, leading to a change in sculptors' work schedules. A scaffolder suggested a different knot that reduced the likelihood of support ropes stretching in damp weather. An elderly marble polisher shared a technique for detecting microfissures invisible to younger eyes. Each improvement was minor in itself, but together they transformed the Parthenon from merely a beautiful building into something approaching perfection. Years later, when the temple was complete and had weathered its first decade of Athenian weather, Damon, now a young man learning the stone carving trade, would often climb to the roof level to check the drainage channels he had worried about as a boy. The water now flowed smoothly, carrying away each season's rains without leaving any trace. The marble beams remained strong and flawless, supporting their burden of tiles and decorative elements with the patient strength of good architecture. But the most beautiful part of these roof visits was not the technical excellence of the repairs. It was the realization that hundreds of other workers also felt empowered to notice, to question, to contribute their own observations to the Hua. Creation of something magnificent. The Parthenon was celebrated for its proportions, its sculptures, its architectural innovations. But among the builders themselves, it was also remembered as the first great project, where wisdom was understood to come from anyone who listened carefully, regardless of age or status. And late at night, as moonlight illuminated the temple's columns and cast long shadows across the Acropolis, you could almost hear the building itself breathing, inhaling the cool night air and exhaling the day's warmth, its perfect drainage carrying away the dew that formed on the marble surfaces. Every part worked in harmony because a 9-year-old boy cared enough to speak up about what he noticed. The Parthenon stands today, its roof still shedding rain as effectively as it did 25 centuries ago. It is a testament to the truth that the most important ideas sometimes come from the smallest voices, if we are wise enough to listen. This ancient wisdom, which speaks to the importance of listening to barely audible voices, and which once saved the magnificent roof of the Parthenon, and profoundly changed the Athenian approach to grand projects, found its way to a completely unexpected place. It manifested during a quiet, almost forgotten festival dedicated to the olive trees that grew abundantly on the slopes surrounding the ancient city. This festival was called Eleophoria, literally meaning olive carrying, and it was celebrated annually on the day that officially marked the beginning of the olive harvest. Unlike the grand and crowded Grand Panathenaea, with its solemn processions and abundant sacrifices, or the dramatic Dionysia, filled with theatrical performances and spectacular competitions, the Eleophoria was a modest local event. Its central focus was on something most residents took for granted: the trees that generously provided oil for lamps, served as a source of food, medicine, and an important element of trade. But in the year our story recounts, something extraordinary happened that transformed this quiet celebration into one of the most poignant and memorable events in the annals of Athenian history. It began with an old woman named Philomena, who, with extraordinary devotion, tended a grove of ancient olive trees sprawling on a hillside overlooking the city. These were not just ordinary olive trees. According to tradition, they descended from the very first olive tree that the goddess Athena miraculously caused to grow from the rock of the Acropolis when she contested with Poseidon for the right to be the city's patron deity. Whether this claim was literally true mattered little to Philomena. What mattered most to her was that these trees were incredibly old, some several centuries old, and they produced the finest oil in all of Attica. Their powerful, gnarled trunks and delicate silvery green leaves were silent witnesses to how Athens transformed from a small settlement into the greatest city in Greece. However, that autumn, Philomena noticed something troubling that caused her serious concern. The trees, as usual, produced an abundant crop of olives, but the fruits seemed somehow different, smaller than usual, and had a bitter taste that had not been present in previous years. At first she assumed the weather might be the cause. The summer had been drier than usual, and perhaps the trees were suffering from a lack of moisture. But as harvest time approached, she began to suspect that something else, something deeper, was happening. The trees, she suddenly realized, were sad. Now, this might sound like the mere fancy of an old woman who had spent too much time alone with her trees, but Philomena had tended olives for 60 years. She knew these particular trees better than most people, and she had learned to read their moods as subtly as others read human expressions. When the trees were happy, after abundant rains, or when the soil was rich, or in peaceful years, when Athens was not at war, their olives were plump and sweet, and their oil golden and fragrant. When they were stressed or neglected, the fruits became small and bitter. But this year felt entirely different. This year the trees seemed to be grieving. As Eleophoria approached, Philomena constantly pondered what could be making these ancient olive trees grieve. She spent evenings sitting among their gnarled trunks, listening to the rustle of the wind in their silver leaves, trying to understand what they were trying to tell her. The answer came to her gradually, like the dawn light slowly revealing a landscape previously hidden in darkness. The trees were old enough to remember. They had lived through generations of human history, watching families be born, grow, and age, becoming silent witnesses to the slow but irreversible changes that had shaped the city over centuries. And what they grieved for, Philomena realized, was not something that had happened recently, but something that was slowly but surely disappearing. The connection between the people of Athens and the fertile land that nourished them was steadily weakening. More and more Athenians preferred to buy olive oil from merchants in the agora, rather than diligently tending their own trees. Families that had maintained small groves for centuries were now selling their land to developers eager to build new homes closer to the city. Young people chose careers in trade, politics, or philosophy, rather than learning the patient arts of farming and careful tree care. This was not anyone's specific fault, of course. Athens was becoming a cosmopolitan, sophisticated city, closely connected to the wider world. In many ways, these were positive changes. But something precious was being lost in the process. A deep knowledge of the changing seasons and the nuances of the soil, the ability to read a tree's health from the color of its leaves, the profound satisfaction that comes from tending something that will outlive you by centuries. On the morning of Eleophoria, Philomena made a decision that surprised even herself with its unusualness. Instead of conducting the traditional ceremony alone in her grove, she loaded a cart with branches from her oldest trees, branches laden with small, sad olives, and brought them into the city. She set up her cart in the agora, not to sell anything, but simply so people could see and touch olive branches from trees that had been growing when their great-grandparents were children. These trees remember, she told anyone who would listen. They remember when your family first came to Athens. They remember the taste of the soil when it was richer, and the sound of more birds singing in the mornings, and how people used to visit them regularly to check on their health. At first, people were polite but distracted. The agora was noisy and most shoppers were busy with their own affairs. But gradually, something surprising and interesting began to happen. An elderly potter named Theron stopped to examine the olive branches closely and began telling stories about the trees his grandfather had planted behind their house. A young mother with twins found that her children were fascinated by the varied shapes of the olive leaves, and she herself explained how olive oil was made. A merchant dealing in luxury goods imported from Egypt and Persia stopped to inhale the distinctive scent of fresh olive wood, and suddenly remembered helping his father harvest olives as a child. The weight of the sacks, the satisfying sound of ripe fruit falling from the branches, how the whole family worked together during the harvest. All these memories resurfaced. By midday, a small crowd had gathered around Philomena's cart. But they weren't just listening to her stories. They were sharing their own memories, asking questions about tree care, openly reflecting on the groves and gardens they had left behind or never learned to tend. It was then that Philomena made her proposal, which became a turning point. What, she said, if instead of just remembering the connection between Athens and its trees, we renew it? What if this Eleophoria becomes not just a harvest festival, but a day when every citizen of the city takes the time to visit the olive groves, to touch the earth, to remember that our civilization grows from the same soil as our trees? The idea caught fire, as truly good ideas sometimes do. Within hours, small groups formed to walk to the olive groves scattered across the hills around Athens. Families who had not visited their ancestral trees in years suddenly decided to make the journey. Young people who had never seen the olive harvest process showed a keen interest. Even city officials joined this informal pilgrimage, including the archon, who usually spent festival days in ceremonial services at the temples. What they discovered in the groves was something none of them had expected. The trees, surrounded by far more people than they had seen in decades, seemed to respond to this attention. The olives that had seemed small and bitter that morning now appeared fuller, more flavorful, when tasted by people who approached them with genuine interest and deep gratitude. But more than that, people discovered what they had been missing without realizing it. The profound peace that comes from connecting with something larger and more permanent than everyday human concerns. Standing beneath branches that had grown for centuries, breathing air purified by leaves that had witnessed the rise of democracy, touching bark that had survived more storms than any human would ever see. It put the anxieties and ambitions of city life into a completely different, deeper perspective. As the day drew to a close, the informal gathering began to take on the character of a true, full-fledged festival. Someone brought a flute, and others began to sing traditional harvest songs, filled with joy and gratitude. Families shared food they had brought for the journey, and elderly gardeners like Philomena found themselves surrounded by young people, eager to learn long-forgotten methods for determining tree health and predicting harvest quality. But the most moving and unforgettable moment came closer to sunset, when a child, a little girl of about 7, pointed to one of the oldest trees and asked a question that silenced the entire crowd. "Why are the trees crying?" Everyone looked where she was pointing, and there, glistening on the bark of several ancient olive trees, were droplets resembling tears, a pure, sweet-smelling moisture that seemed to ooze from the very wood. For a moment, no one spoke, enveloped in a reverent silence. Then Philomena smiled and knelt beside the little girl. "Those aren't sad tears," she said softly. "Those are happy tears. The trees are crying for joy because their people have come home to visit them." Whether this was scientifically accurate didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone present understood in that moment that they had rekindled something incredibly important. Not only their deep connection to the trees that nourished their city, but also their understanding of themselves as integral participants in something much larger than individual, fleeting human lives. Eleophoria thereafter became an annual ritual, but by no means a celebration burdened with strict protocols, official ceremonies, and prescribed rites. Instead, it retained its original essence, just as it had appeared on that very first day, a time when the people of Athens paid tribute to their green patrons, to feel the living breath of the soil, to spend a day outside the city walls surrounded by lush vegetation. And every year on this significant day, the olive trees throughout Attica seemed to shed their bountiful, happy tears, reminding anyone who cared to notice that some of life's most meaningful connections are with creatures who, though silent, have listened to everything for centuries. This profound wisdom about silent connections, taught by the olive trees to the people of Athens, crossed the wine-dark sea and reached a small island called Scheria, where an aged shipwright named Nausicaa toiled in a secluded cove, so tranquil that even the waves whispered their stories rather than crashing with thunder. You might recognize the name Nausicaa from Homer's epic tales of Odysseus. But this was not the beautiful young princess who found the hero washed up on her sandy shores. This was her venerable great-aunt, a woman who had dedicated 6 decades of her life to understanding every nuance of how wooden ships maintain their integrity in the face of the sea's changing moods. Nausicaa, the shipbuilder, resided in her workshop, imbued with the pungent aroma of pine resin and the fresh breath of the sea, where curved olive timbers awaited their hour to become the sturdy skeleton of vessels that would safely transport travelers across waters capable of instantly transforming from gently inviting to deadly menacing. Her renown spread throughout the nearby islands because she built ships that invariably found their way home. These were not the fastest ships, nor the most beautiful, nor those that could carry the heaviest cargo, but they were the ones that plied the seas year after year, season after season, delivering their crews to loving families who scanned the horizon for the familiar outlines of sails. The secret to her success held no drama, no mystical enigma. It lay simply in her keen attention to the minute details that other craftsmen neglected, and in her never forgetting that the ocean's power surpassed any creation of human hands. Every timber destined for her ships was carefully selected, not just for strength, but for how it behaved under humidity, drought, heat, cold, and the bending stresses of waves crashing from different directions. She knew that olive wood possessed a unique flexibility, allowing it to deform without breaking, that pine, though light, required meticulous treatment to resist rot, that oak, while exceptionally strong, carried significant weight that could slow a vessel in light tailwinds. Moreover, she understood that a ship was not merely an assembly of wooden elements joined by ropes and bronze fastenings. It was rather a living entity, meant to exist in harmony with powerful forces beyond human control. On that momentous day when Odysseus stepped onto her secluded beach, Nausicaa was labouring over a vessel that she felt might be the last of her long career. Her hands, once so nimble and skilled, now trembled slightly as she held small tools, and her gaze sometimes struggled to discern the finest patterns of wood grain that guided her decisions on how to properly carve and shape each element. She looked up from her painstaking work and saw a man walking leisurely along the shore, carefully inspecting the many boats pulled onto the sand, with the discerning eye of someone deeply knowledgeable about the subject. He was a man of middle age, his hair touched with grey, his skin weathered by sun and sea salt. His garments, though finely made, bore clear signs of long travel, not mere necessity. When he reached her workshop, he paused, silently observing her work, which immediately told her he was either a master craftsman himself or a man who had learned to appreciate the deep focus required for meticulous labour. After a few minutes, she set down her tools, fixing him with a direct, penetrating gaze. "You are not from Scheria," she said. Her words were a statement, not a question. "No," he replied. "I am trying to return home to Ithaca. My journey has taken longer than I anticipated." His voice clearly held weariness, yet also a subtle diplomacy, making it clear that what he said was a modest understatement of the true situation. Nausicaa, over her years of work, had built ships for merchants, fishermen, and refugees, and she had learned to unerringly read the diverse stories that brought people to her workshop. In this man's demeanour was the mark of one who had seen far more of the world than he ever wished. "Ithaca is not far," she said, "but the waters between us can be treacherous. What vessel do you intend to choose for your journey?" Odysseus, though he had not yet introduced himself by name, pointed to the harbour where several merchant ships bobbed at anchor, patiently awaiting a favourable wind. "I had hoped to book passage on one of them, but the captains relentlessly delay their departure, and I am beginning to think I would prefer something smaller, but significantly more reliable." Nausicaa looked closely at his face, unerringly reading the nuances of frustration and unwavering determination. "Perhaps a vessel you can manage yourself, should the need arise. I have managed boats before." And this, to be sure, was another vivid example of significant understatement, though Nausicaa did not yet know it. But she did know that this traveller possessed the patient, discerning demeanour of a man who had learned the wisdom of not relying entirely on the decisions of others for his fate. "I believe I have just the thing," she said, leading him to another part of her workshop, where a small but remarkably elegant sailboat rested on sturdy wooden supports. I built it for my nephew, but he chose the path of a philosopher instead of a fisherman. It has been waiting for its true sailor. The beauty of the boat was that particular beauty inherent in things whose functionality has been perfected. Every line was flawlessly clean and imbued with deep meaning. Every joint was fitted with that unsurpassed precision born only from decades of meticulous experience. But what impressed Odysseus most was that it looked as though it had been specifically designed to withstand the harshest trials. Its hull was noticeably deeper than usual for a vessel of its size, providing it with increased stability even in the choppiest waters. The rigging was simple, yet exceptionally robust, designed to be managed by a single person even in the most adverse conditions. Most importantly, he could see additional storage compartments built into the hull. Places for provisions, water, and emergency supplies, capable of determining the outcome between life and death in case of an unexpectedly prolonged journey. She is built for one who understands that the sea is utterly indifferent to your plans and schedules, Nausicaa explained, gently running her hand along its smooth side. Fast enough when the wind is favorable, steady enough when it is not, and strong enough to keep going where other vessels would have turned back. Over the next few days, as Odysseus awaited favorable weather conditions to begin his journey home, he found himself spending more and more time in Nausicaa's workshop, formally to learn the intricacies of his future vessel, but essentially because he was increasingly captivated by her unique approach to her craft. He had seen the work of many shipbuilders throughout the Mediterranean, commanded vessels constructed by the greatest masters of the Hellenic world, yet he had never met anyone who perceived ships as Nausicaa did, not merely as objects to be built and used, but as faithful partners in the complex art of survival amidst the boundless expanse of the sea. "The sea is not your enemy," she explained one afternoon as they sat in the blessed shade of her workshop, sharing a modest meal of bread and olives while the boat dried after a fresh coat of protective oil. "But neither is it your friend. It is something far more multifaceted, like a powerful neighbor who does not speak your language, but whose mood you vitally need to understand if you seek peaceful coexistence." She pointed to the harbor, where the water's surface shifted its hues from deep blue to emerald and grey as clouds drifted across the sunny sky. Every new day, the sea presents itself differently. Different winds, shifting currents, fluctuating temperatures. The very waters that one day will carry you home with ease and safety can swallow you the next, if you approach them with an improper attitude. "What is the proper attitude?" Odysseus asked, with genuine curiosity. "Respect devoid of fear, confidence not bordering on arrogance, and always, always, a backup plan." As they spoke, Nausicaa began to refine the vessel, taking into account everything she had learned about Odysseus's unique situation. She added extra cleats for secure cargo fastening, installed a more advanced steering system that made single-person control easier, and most importantly, she initiated him into the art of reading the subtlest omens that would signal impending weather changes even before they became threatening. "Notice how the water looks different near those rocks," she pointed out during one of their trial sails in the harbour. "That is a sure sign of a changing current. And observe how the birds stay closer to shore than they did this morning. This usually heralds an approaching wind from a different direction." However, the most invaluable lesson she taught him was not technical expertise. It was the art of patience. "I understand your heart yearns to return home," she said one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the water golden red. "You have been away for a long time, and someone is eagerly awaiting you." Odysseus nodded silently, lost in thoughts of Penelope and Telemachus, of the life he had left behind, which now seemed an eternity ago. However, impatience can be a fatal danger at sea, Nausicaa continued. It urges you to rush where you should be patient, and to take risks where extreme caution is required. The sea rewards patience and punishes haste with far greater consistency than any other force I know. She paused for a moment, watching the water darken under the cover of the approaching night. "The vessel will take you home, but only if you allow it to do its work, without trying to force it to do yours." Early that morning, when Odysseus finally set sail, the weather conditions were exemplary. A steady wind blew from a favorable direction, the sky was cloudless, and the sea remained remarkably calm. However, just before his departure, Nausicaa presented him with a parting gift. It was a small wooden box, meticulously sealed with wax and equipped with sturdy leather straps designed for secure fastening inside the boat's hull. "These are emergency supplies," she explained. "Non-perishable food, fresh water, basic repair tools, but also something else." "What exactly?" Odysseus inquired. "Instructions for building a signal fire," Nausicaa replied, "written in several different languages and dialects. If you find yourself in an unforeseen situation, this will help you communicate your location to anyone who can offer assistance." Odysseus accepted the box with the same serious attentiveness with which he had approached everything she had taught him. "Why do you do all this for a stranger?" he asked. Nausicaa smiled, her gaze fixed on the boat, which gently swayed in the shallow water, ready for the journey ahead. "Because every sailor who returns home safely makes the sea a little friendlier for the next person who must cross it. Your safe journey becomes part of a collective knowledge that helps other sailors stay alive." When Odysseus sailed from Scheria that morning, he carried with him something far more significant than just a skillfully built boat and practical supplies. He carried a deep understanding that true craftsmanship, at its highest level, always serves something greater than immediate need. It contributes to an accumulated wisdom that allows communities to survive and thrive. The boat Nausicaa crafted indeed carried him home to Ithaca, where Penelope awaited him, and where his long-suffering story could finally reach its logical conclusion. Perhaps even more importantly, the lessons she taught him about patience, respect, and preparation became an integral part of his later life. And years later, when young sailors from Ithaca came to him for advice on long voyages, he shared with them what the elderly shipwright had taught him. The most important skill for any journey is not the ability to go fast, but the ability to keep going when the path becomes difficult. This invaluable wisdom about enduring through difficult times, which Nausicaa shared with Odysseus in her peaceful cove, later found its way to a far less tranquil place, the dusty border region between two city-states. These cities had been at war with each other for so long that most people had forgotten the true cause of the conflict. The war between Megalopolis and Clea began over water rights, or perhaps trade routes, or maybe an old insult delivered at a diplomatic dinner 30 years ago. The details of the conflict had blurred over decades of raids, counter-raids, burned harvests, and interrupted lives. One thing remained clear. Both cities were exhausted. Both populations were tired of sending their young people to war, and yet neither side could figure out how to end this protracted conflict. This was largely due to pride and the fear that ceasing hostilities would be perceived as a defeat. In a small farmhouse located exactly halfway between the two warring cities lived an elderly widow named Karina. She had the misfortune of owning land that both armies considered strategically important. Her fields provided high ground useful for observing enemy movements, and her well was the only reliable source of fresh water for miles around. This meant her farm regularly changed hands, sometimes controlled by Megalopolis, sometimes by Clea, depending on whose soldiers were more successful in the latest skirmish. Karina had learned to maintain diplomatic neutrality, providing water and sometimes food to whoever occupied her land, while trying to protect her vegetable garden and small flock of chickens from the ravages of war. It was not an easy life, but Karina had developed a philosophy that helped her cope. She focused on the small daily tasks that made sense regardless of what was happening in the larger world. She fed her chickens, tended her garden, mended whatever needed mending. She treated all visitors politely but cautiously. The morning that changed the course of events began, like many others, with Karina discovering traces of both armies' soldiers having been on her property overnight. A patrol from Megalopolis had camped near her well, leaving behind the usual debris of a military meal, scattered olive pits, bread crusts, and a broken clay water jug that had apparently cracked when someone dropped it. About an hour later, a scouting party from Clea arrived to check if the Megalopolis soldiers were still in the area. Finding only Karina sweeping the remnants of their meal into a basket, the Clea captain relaxed and asked if his men could water their horses. At her well. Of course, she agreed. She always agreed. Refusing water to armed soldiers was not a viable strategy for a lone old woman. But as the Clea soldiers watered their horses, one of them noticed the broken pottery shards in Karina's basket. "That's a fine water jug," he commented. "A shame it's broken. It looked like good work." Karina paused her sweeping. "It was beautiful," she admitted. "I admired it before it was dropped. The clay was so smooth and the painting along the rim was delicate work. Someone put real care into making it." The soldier, whose name was Theron, knelt and picked up several large pieces, fitting them together to reconstruct the original shape. "My sister makes pottery like this," he said quietly. "The same painting technique, the same style of handles. It might even be her work." He held up a piece showing part of an intricate pattern. Geometric designs intertwined with tiny flowers, painted in the characteristic blue-black color for which Clea's potters were famous. "It is her work," he said with sudden certainty. "I helped her load these jugs onto a merchant's cart just 2 months ago. She was so proud of that batch, said they were the best she had ever made." Karina looked at the broken pottery with increased interest. "Your sister's work, it seems, ended up with the soldiers of Megalopolis. Which means—" Theron trailed off, considering the implications. "Which means that despite this war, people from our cities are still trading with each other. Someone from Megalopolis liked these jugs enough to buy them." It was a small revelation, but it began a conversation that continued after the other soldiers finished watering their horses and were ready to move on. Theron lingered, still examining the pottery shards, reluctant to leave this unexpected connection to his sister's work. "May I?" he began hesitantly. "May I take a piece with me to show her? She'll be hurt to know one of her jugs is broken, but she'll also be pleased to know it travelled so far and was used by someone who appreciated good craftsmanship." Karina not only agreed but spent the next few minutes helping him choose a piece that best showcased his sister's distinctive painting style. As they worked together, she found herself telling him about other items she had noticed over the years. Weapons, tools, clothing, decorative items worn by soldiers of both armies, many of which had clearly been made in the opposing city. It's as if the war is happening on top of a completely different reality, she mused. One where people from both cities actually love and need what the other city produces. This conversation might have remained just an interesting moment between two people, had it not been for what happened when Theron returned to his unit with the pottery fragment and the story behind it. His sister, Melina, was indeed touched to learn that her work had reached Megalopolis and was appreciated there. But more than that, she was intrigued by the idea that trade between the two cities was continuing despite the official state of war. She began to ask questions of other artisans, merchants, and even soldiers she knew. What she discovered was that over the years, a complex web of unofficial trade had developed, with goods from both cities reaching consumers in the other, through intermediaries, circuitous routes, and informal arrangements that everyone pretended not to notice. Megalopolis produced excellent olive oil and wine, but their pottery was utilitarian at best. Clea created beautiful pottery and metalwork, but their soil was unsuitable for olives, and their wine was notoriously terrible. Despite 30 years of official hostility, people from both cities had found ways to get what they needed from each other. Melina dared to take an unprecedented step. She loaded a cart with her finest pottery to sell it not through intermediaries, but to deliver it directly to Megalopolis, offering it to people who had been buying her work indirectly for years. It was a bold move that could have resulted in her arrest, exile, or worse. But when she arrived in the marketplace of Megalopolis, something unexpected happened. People immediately recognized her style. Several buyers approached her to say they already owned her work and hoped to find more. Some mentioned specific jugs or bowls they had bought from traveling merchants, describing them with the detailed appreciation that comes only from daily use and genuine admiration. More importantly, they began to speak with her about their own needs and preferences, giving her design suggestions that would be even more useful in their homes, asking about custom pieces that would solve specific problems they faced. By the end of the day, Melina had not only sold everything she brought, but had taken orders for 12 custom pieces. More importantly, she had established direct relationships with people who had previously been merely anonymous buyers, reached through the shadowy network of wartime trade. News of such a successful visit, like a wildfire, quickly spread through both cities, and within weeks, other skilled artisans began to undertake similar direct trading journeys. For example, a winemaker from Megalopolis travelled to Clea to find connoisseurs and buyers for his fine wines, and a skilled metalworker from Clea, in turn, delivered specialized tools to the craftsmen of Megalopolis, who had for years fruitlessly sought precisely such implements. Each triumphant trade visit clearly demonstrated the same undeniable truth. Despite 30 years of official enmity, the residents of both cities had far more in common than reasons for conflict. They needed similar goods, they equally valued quality, and they encountered very similar difficulties in their daily lives. The political changes, when they finally occurred, unfolded with astonishing speed. Warriors from both armies grew increasingly reluctant to raid communities where their own relatives now regularly traded. It became harder for military leaders to justify attacking cities that supplied goods vital and desired by their own people. And most importantly, the economic benefits of direct trade was so obvious that both city councils began to experience strong pressure from their citizens, who demanded a way to formally and permanently solidify trade relations. The actual peace negotiations, held at Melina's suggestion, took place at Karina's farm, a neutral territory that ironically had unconsciously become the starting point for great change. Representatives from both cities sat at Karina's simple wooden table, sharing a meal that included olive oil from Megalopolis, wine clearly not from Clea, and food served in pottery that Melina had specially crafted for this momentous occasion. The treaty they signed was surprisingly concise and simple. Both cities agreed to cease hostilities and establish formal trade relations that would bring mutual benefit to all participants. All disputes were to be resolved through arbitration, not through war. Young people could now choose careers in trade and craft instead of compulsory military service. But perhaps the most important provision was one that established an annual festival held at Karina's farm, celebrating the end of the war and the beginning of peaceful cooperation. A central element of this celebration was to be an exhibition of pottery created by skilled artisans from both cities, including pieces specially made to commemorate the peace. However, at the very center of the exhibition, in a place of honor, were to be fragments of the very broken water jug that had started the entire process of reconciliation. Years later, as the children of former enemies played carefree together in Karina's garden, and their parents exchanged goods and shared life stories, people often remarked with surprise how astonishing it was that such a trivial thing as a broken pot could have ended such a prolonged conflict. But Karina, now recognized as an unofficial patroness of practical peacemaking, would merely smile and point out that the war was not ended by a broken pot at all. It was the willingness to see that beneath the surface of any conflict, people usually desire the same simple things: good work, fair trade, safe communities, and the ability to appreciate beauty in their daily lives. The broken pot merely made these common desires visible to those who had forgotten to look for them. This profound understanding of shared human desires, lurking beneath superficial conflicts, which ended a 30-year war over a broken pot, made its way to the island of Crete, and into the very heart of one of the most famous and terrifying stories in all of Greek mythology. This refers to the tale of the Minotaur in his labyrinth, awaiting his tribute of young Athenian lives. But our story is not about Theseus the hero or Ariadne the princess with her ball of thread, nor even about the monster itself. It tells of an old shepherd named Lycon, who grazed his flocks on the hills overlooking King Minos's palace, and who happened to be in the wrong place, but at the right time to witness the end of what had terrorized the Mediterranean world for a generation. Lycaon had grazed sheep and goats on these hills for 40 years, under 3 different kings, watching the palace below grow larger and more complex with each passing decade. He had seen the construction of the great labyrinth, that intricate tangle of corridors and chambers that had been built to contain something too dangerous to kill, yet too valuable to simply release. He had never seen the Minotaur himself. Few had, of course, except for the unfortunate youths who were sent into the labyrinth as tribute, and they rarely survived to describe the terrifying experience. But Lycaon had heard the creature's voice, especially on quiet nights when the wind blew from the direction of the palace. It was not a roar or a bellow, as one might expect from a monster, but something far more unsettling, a sound that was part human cry and part animal wail, the voice of a being that belonged entirely to neither world. This sound had haunted Lycaon's dreams for years, and he often wondered what it must be like to live in such terrible solitude, trapped in a labyrinth with no company save the occasional terrified visitor who came only to die. On the morning that proved to be the Minotaur's last, Lycaon led his flock to pasture on a slope that offered the best view of the palace courtyard. He chose this spot for no particular reason, simply because there was good grass there, and the sheep seemed to prefer it. As he settled into his usual routine, watching the animals, mending torn clothing, eating a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, he noticed unusual activity at the palace below. A ship had arrived during the night, clearly Athenian in its design and sail pattern. It was the tribute ship, bringing the 14 young people who were to be sent into the labyrinth to feed the monster. Lycaon had seen this grim ritual many times, and it never grew easier to watch. The young Athenians would be led from the harbour, given a last meal, and then marched to the labyrinth's entrance, while priests chanted prayers that everyone knew were meaningless. By evening, the wailing from the labyrinth would cease, and everyone understood that the tribute had been accepted. But this time, something was different, though Lycaon couldn't quite say why. Perhaps it was something in the way the guards moved, less routine and more alert than usual. Perhaps it was that one of the young Athenians, a tall youth with dark hair, seemed to be conversing seriously with the Cretan princess, rather than simply accepting his fate with resignation. Or perhaps it was simply that after 40 years of watching the same tragic cycle repeat itself over and over, Lycaon had developed an intuition for when something was about to change. As the day progressed, he found himself paying more attention to the palace than to his sheep. The animals were well trained and unlikely to wander far, so he allowed himself to become absorbed in watching the small dramas unfolding in the courtyard below. He saw the Athenian princess, Ariadne. He thought she was having what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone who might have been the chief architect of the labyrinth. He saw guards positioned around the labyrinth's entrance, but in a pattern that seemed designed more to keep people out than to prevent escape. Most intriguingly, he saw the young Athenian youth inspecting the walls around the labyrinth's entrance, with the careful attention of someone planning something more complex than simply entering and hoping for the best. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the familiar ritual commenced. The 14 young Athenians were brought to the labyrinth's entrance, and Lycaon braced himself for another night of what he expected would be a vigil. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of all 14 captives being sent into the labyrinth together, only the tall youth entered. The others led away, presumably to be held elsewhere until what? Lycaon settled in for what he expected to be a long night of waiting. In his experience, the sounds from the labyrinth typically lasted for several hours. First, the noise of people trying to find their way out, then the encounter with the Minotaur, then the final terrible silence. But this night was different from the start. Instead of the usual sounds of panicked running and disjointed screams, Lycaon heard something that sounded almost impossible. From that distance, it was hard to make out words. But the rhythm of the sounds emanating from the labyrinth suggested two voices, not the usual pattern of human terror and animal response. This continued, it seemed, for hours. Sometimes the voices seemed to move deeper into the labyrinth, sometimes closer to the entrance. Sometimes there were periods of silence. Then the conversation would resume, and gradually, Lycaon began to understand that one of the voices was changing. the sound that had haunted his dreams for years. That terrible mix of human sorrow and animal despair was still there, but it was becoming more human, less feral, more articulate, as if something lost was slowly being remembered. Near dawn, the sound ceased entirely, and Lycaon braced himself for the usual announcement that the tribute had been accepted and the Minotaur's hunger sated for another year. Instead, he saw the tall young Athenian emerge from the labyrinth's entrance, alive and seemingly unharmed. Following him was a figure Lycaon never expected to see in daylight, the Minotaur himself. But the creature that followed the youth out of the labyrinth was not the monster Lycaon had imagined during those nights, listening to its cries. It was clearly part human and part bull, yes, but in its posture, in the way it moved, there was something that spoke of intelligence and even dignity, not simple animal ferocity. The subsequent events surpassed all expectations in their unusualness. The Minotaur showed no aggression towards anyone present. He made no attempts to escape or cause havoc within the palace complex. On the contrary, he stood silently beside the young Athenian, carefully surveying the world outside the labyrinth, as if for the first time in many years, daylight had opened to his eyes. From his position on the hillside, Lycaon watched as guards and court officials gradually gathered in the courtyard, their astonishment at what was happening evident and no less than the shepherd's own. Heated discussions unfolded, accompanied by active gestures towards the labyrinth, the two figures standing at its entrance, and the harbour where the Athenian ship patiently awaited. After prolonged debates, which seemed to last for hours, a small group formed. The young Athenian, the Minotaur, Princess Ariadne, and several others slowly made their way to the harbour. As crowds gathered along the route to witness this truly unprecedented spectacle, Lycaon entrusted his sheep to the care of his faithful and skilled dogs, and descended the hill. Driven by an unrelenting curiosity that had been building within him for hours, he yearned to comprehend what exactly had transpired in the depths of that labyrinth that could transform a monster into the creature it now appeared to be. By the time Lycaon reached the harbour, the Athenian ship was already completing its final preparations for departure. The youth who had dared to enter the labyrinth, people called him Theseus, stood on the pier, engaged in what appeared to be a farewell conversation with the Minotaur. Lycaon positioned himself close enough to catch fragments of their dialogue. "Are you truly certain you don't wish to come with us?" Theseus inquired. "Athens would welcome you with open arms. There are scholars there who would be quite curious about your unique perspective on the world." The Minotaur's voice, in response, was hoarse from long years of silence, yet it clearly demonstrated intelligence. "Thank you, but no," he said. "I have spent too many years in darkness. I need to relearn life in the light, and I think I must do it here, in the place of my birth." He gestured towards the palace, where King Minos watched the proceedings from a high balcony. "Besides, my father and I have matters to discuss, affairs that have been waiting 30 years for resolution." As the Athenian ship, carrying Theseus and the 13 youths saved from their customary fate as tribute, finally pushed off from shore, Lycaon unexpectedly found himself walking alongside the Minotaur, who was slowly making his way back to the palace. "Forgive me," Lycaon said softly, "but I couldn't help but wonder what happened in there, in the depths of the labyrinth." The Minotaur stopped and turned to the old shepherd, his gaze surprisingly gentle for a creature of such formidable and even terrifying appearance. "I was listened to," he simply replied. For the first time in 30 years, someone entered that labyrinth, not with the intention of killing me or dying themselves, but simply to listen. And as I learned to speak again, not just to rage, I was able to think clearly again. He paused for a moment, looking at the labyrinth that had served as both his prison and his home for so long. In truth, I was never a monster, you know. I was just confused, angry, isolated. When you spend so much time alone with your rage, it becomes incredibly difficult to remember what caused that rage in the first place. Aegean nodded silently, the long, lonely nights when terrifying cries echoed through the hills resurfacing in his memory. "What do you intend to do now?" he asked. "I suppose I will learn to be part of society again, and help my father realize that fear and isolation don't actually strengthen kingdoms. They just make everyone more miserable," the Minotaur replied. He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face, making it appear more human than bovine. Perhaps this event was the catalyst for developing more effective methods of conflict resolution than sacrificing youths to monsters in labyrinths. Years later, when Crete became known throughout the Mediterranean not for its cruel demands for tribute, but for its innovative approaches to diplomacy and dispute resolution, visitors often asked Lycaon about the day he supposedly witnessed the Minotaur's death. However, Lycaon always gently corrected them, saying, "The Minotaur did not die that day. The monster did." What emerged from the labyrinth was merely a man who finally remembered how to be a man again. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind died down and the sheep settled peacefully in their pens, Lycaon would recall the sound of those voices in the labyrinth again. Two beings conversing with each other through the veil of their different forms of loneliness, finding their way to understanding in the darkness, teaching each other how to live in the light. This profound lesson about finding understanding through different forms of loneliness, which transformed a monster back into a man in the mysterious depths of the Cretan labyrinth, eventually reached the bustling agora of Athens. There it found its home in the most unlikely of places, a small vegetable stall run by a former slave named Zeno, known for developing a truly unique method of dispute resolution. Zeno's stall itself was unremarkable, a plain wooden table laden with an abundance of seasonal vegetables, a few woven baskets for storage, and a modest stool where he could sit during unhurried daytime hours. Its true uniqueness, however, lay in the fact that residents from all corners of Athens flocked there not only for fresh onions and turnips, but also to seek Zeno's help in resolving disagreements they were unable to settle on their own. Such a practice arose quite unintentionally. Zeno had spent most of his adult life in slavery, owned by several masters who skillfully utilized his remarkable intellect for managing household accounts and resolving disputes among other slaves. He earned a solid reputation as a fair and judicious sage, and it was these qualities that ultimately earned him his long-awaited freedom when his last master deemed it morally inconvenient to own such a man. The first instance of anyone asking Zeno to intervene occurred purely by chance. His stall happened to be exactly in the middle of two fishmongers who were fiercely arguing over whose responsibility it was to clean the shared area where their stalls met. With his newfound freedom came the pressing need to earn a living, and selling vegetables seemed a simple and straightforward occupation. He bought produce from farmers in the morning, sold it to city dwellers throughout the day, and made every effort to avoid losses from anything that might spoil before finding a buyer. However, Athens was a city where every resident had a strong opinion on every matter, and the agora, in turn, was the place where these numerous opinions most frequently clashed. Buyers argued heatedly over prices, sellers disputed the boundaries of their stalls, neighbours quarrelled over a wide variety of trifles, from borrowed tools to stray chickens. Conflicts erupted in the market with enviable regularity. "You settle this," one of them addressed Zeno, apparently believing that anyone capable of maintaining such impeccably neat piles of vegetables must surely possess sound judgment in matters of boundaries and responsibilities. Zeno could have refused. It wasn't his problem, and he had his own affairs to attend to. However, the dispute was bothering his few customers, and he clearly saw that both fishmongers were perfectly reasonable men, simply stuck in an impasse from which they could not exit without losing their dignity. So he listened carefully to both sides, asked a few clarifying questions about how other pairs of merchants handled similar situations, and proposed a solution that proved so obviously fair that both men immediately agreed to it. Word of this successful mediation spread rapidly through the informal communication network of the Agora, and within a few weeks people began regularly coming to Zeno, asking him to help resolve their own disagreements. As a slave, he deeply understood what it meant to be powerless in a conflict, which made him especially sensitive to people who felt overwhelmed by more powerful opponents. Managing intricate household affairs, he had honed the ability to find pragmatic solutions to problems that sometimes seemed incredibly intractable. And, living among people of diverse social strata, he had learned to recognize the universal human needs that underpinned most disagreements. Zeno found this activity almost as fulfilling as selling vegetables, and that his unusual life experience provided him with advantages that more traditional arbitrators often lacked. Most importantly, he developed what he called the vegetable seller's approach to conflict resolution. When a person comes to buy an onion, he would explain to those interested in his methods, they don't actually just want an onion. They want to make a rich soup, or season a fragrant stew, or prepare a meal that will bring their family together at the table. The onion is merely a tool they need to achieve what they truly desire. The same happens with disputes. People don't actually seek to win an argument. They want to feel respected, or protected, or understood. The argument is simply the means they use to try and satisfy these deep-seated needs. As an illustration, consider a typical case where two neighbours were in conflict over a disputed plot of land. Traditional arbitration methods would focus on precise surveys, examination of title deeds, and review of legal precedents to determine an indisputable boundary. Zeno, on the other hand, would inquire what each neighbour actually hoped to accomplish on the disputed plot, and then seek solutions that would allow both people to achieve their goals without necessarily settling the purely technical question of ownership. This approach led him to ask different questions than most arbitrators. Instead of focusing on determining right and wrong, he sought to understand what each person needed to feel satisfied with the outcome of the conflict resolution. Often, these ingenious solutions proved far more effective than strict legal verdicts, as they addressed the genuine problems people faced, rather than merely the formal complaints they filed. According to ancient Athenian law, theft of such magnitude carried extremely severe consequences, up to and including the death penalty, and in less strict cases, inevitable exile and complete financial ruin. However, Clemens stood firm, asserting his innocence, and to many who knew the potter well, it seemed incredible that he would risk everything he had for money, especially since his thriving pottery business easily provided for his family's well-being. But the story that would later transform the entire Athenian legal system began with events far more significant than ordinary disputes over land. Boundaries or trade disagreements. A wealthy merchant named Hippias brought a serious accusation against a young artisan, Clemen, claiming that Clemen had stolen valuable silver coins from his dwelling during a dinner party. The evidence presented was circumstantial but nonetheless quite convincing. Clemen had been in the room where the money was kept. He left the celebration earlier than others without a clear explanation. And finally, the next morning, the disappearance of the coins was discovered. When the two men, feeling clear embarrassment and awkwardness both towards each other and the situation, finally appeared before Zeno's vegetable stall, the latter made a most unusual request of them. The situation was complicated by the deep social inequality between the parties in the conflict. Hippias, being a very wealthy and well-connected man, was accustomed to always getting his way. Clemen, though respected in his circle, possessed neither the power nor sufficient means to hire skilled legal defense capable of effectively countering the evidence presented. Hippias could have immediately turned to the official courts, where his high social standing and seemingly irrefutable evidence would almost guarantee a conviction. However, someone, perhaps even his own wife, who harbored doubts about the validity of the accusation, advised him to first approach Zeno, who by then had gained wide renown as a man capable of uncovering hidden facets of conflicts not obvious at first glance. Before we delve into the details of what happened, Zeno began, let me understand what each of you needs for this matter to be considered fairly resolved. Clemen was more hesitant than his opponent. It is vitally important to me that people know I am not a thief. My reputation is all I have. If the citizens of the city think I am capable of theft, my pottery business will decline, and my family will be in dire straits. Hippias, as is often the case with wealthy individuals, responded first and more decisively. I need my property returned, and I need assurances that no one will be able to steal my belongings with impunity in the future. Zeno nodded thoughtfully, considering what he had heard. So you need your silver returned, he addressed Hippias. And you need your reputation intact, he said to Clemen. What if we could achieve both these goals without necessarily establishing whether a theft actually occurred? Both men looked clearly puzzled by this approach, and Zeno continued his investigation. Hippias, please tell me about the dinner party. Who was present? What exactly happened? When did you discover the money was missing? When was the last time you counted the silver before the party? Zeno inquired in detail. The most intriguing circumstance was that the missing coins were only discovered the morning after the celebration, but Hippias could not accurately recall when he had last checked for their presence. As the story unfolded, several interesting details emerged. The dinner party was crowded and noisy, guests moved freely throughout Hippias's house. The silver coins were kept in a wooden box in a room used to store guests' cloaks and other personal belongings during the party. Several people entered and exited this room throughout the evening. I suppose it's possible, Hippias admitted, but he had to consider the point carefully. I'm not sure. Perhaps it was several days ago, maybe even a week. So the coins could have disappeared even before the party, and during the party many people had access to the room where the coins were kept, Zeno clarified. Yes, but Clemen was the only one who left early, Hippias objected. It was here that Zeno's experience as a former slave proved invaluable. He understood the subtleties of household arrangements and dynamics within a household in ways that free citizens often could not, and he knew what questions to ask that others might simply overlook. Well, there were a few, but I trust my household servants completely," Hippias replied. "I'm sure you trust them, but trust and opportunity are entirely different things," Zeno emphasized. "Could someone have taken the coins before the party, and the theft was only discovered afterward, when you checked the box? Hippias, who else had access to your home in the days leading up to the party? Servants, merchants, couriers?" In the end, Zeno summarized his point. Thus, we have missing silver that could have disappeared at any point during a week-long period when many people had access to it. We have a suspect whose early departure from the party, it turns out, had nothing to do with theft. And most importantly, we have two individuals whose true needs, security and reputation, do not actually require us to determine guilt or innocence with absolute certainty. As they delved deeper into this new possibility, a completely different picture of events began to emerge. Hippias' house had indeed been unusually busy in the days leading up to the party, as additional workers had been brought in to help with preparations. The room where the silver coins were kept had been temporarily used to store extra supplies and equipment. But most importantly, when Zeno asked more detailed questions about Clemen's behavior during the celebration, it became abundantly clear that the potter had left early not because he was trying to abscond with stolen property, but because he felt deeply uncomfortable at social gatherings and used a family obligation as a polite excuse for his departure. As a resolution to the conflict, it was proposed that Clemen create a unique ceramic piece for Hippias, something exceedingly valuable and aesthetically beautiful. This creation was to serve a dual purpose: to be a kind of apology for the unfounded suspicions, and simultaneously a vivid demonstration of goodwill. In turn, Hippias would publicly acknowledge that the evidence presented against Clemen was not conclusive, thereby completely restoring the potter's good name. Furthermore, both men committed to working together to improve security measures in Hippias's home to prevent similar incidents in the future. Zeno's proposed solution was strikingly practical and far-sighted. Both parties to the dispute readily agreed to this resolution, which fully addressed their true concerns without requiring anyone to admit guilt or suffer public loss of face. However, this case attracted the close attention of Athenian jurists, who were extremely intrigued by Zeno's innovative approach to a problem that the traditional judicial system would undoubtedly have resolved much more harshly and likely with less satisfaction for all parties. The law that was eventually passed was based directly on Zeno's unique methods and profound philosophy. It clearly recognized that not all conflicts necessarily had to be resolved by formally determining guilt and innocence, and that often creative, flexible solutions served the interests of all parties far better than the rigid and unyielding application of legal precedents. For several months, the Athenian Assembly actively debated a proposal to create an entirely new category of legal procedure, voluntary mediation, which would offer disputing parties the opportunity to seek resolution for their disagreements through specially trained arbitrators before or instead of going to court. Law is not something that should exist in isolation from daily life, Zeno explained, sharing his wisdom. It should grow from how people actually need to coexist, like vegetables that thrive in properly cultivated soil. Zeno himself, by then recognized as one of the most skilled mediators in the city, while still occasionally selling turnips from his stall, would merely smile and invariably point out that the best solutions generally arise where people meet as equals to solve practical problems together. Years later, when Athens became widely known throughout Greece for its innovative approach to dispute resolution, numerous visitors often expressed genuine surprise that such a significant legal reform originated not in lofty courts or philosophical schools, but in a humble vegetable stall in the agora. And perhaps in this lies the deepest and most beautiful truth, that justice, like good vegetables, grows and strengthens best when it is deeply rooted in the real conditions in which ordinary people live, and when it is cultivated by those who understand that the true goal is not to win arguments, but to foster the prosperity of the entire community. This profound understanding of justice, as something organically growing from the real circumstances of human life, which so radically transformed Athenian law, thanks to the wisdom of a humble vegetable seller, later made its way to the most unexpected place. It penetrated the workshop of a sculptor who worked with a woman known to all as Medusa. In those days she was still just an ordinary person, possessing beautiful hair and an astonishing talent for remaining perfectly, absolutely still. This was long before the curse befell her, before snakes replaced her hair, before heroes hunted her head as a trophy. In those distant days, Medusa was simply a young woman living on a small island off the coast of the land that would later be called Libya. She earned her living by posing as a model for an elderly sculptor named Andrikos, whose specialty was creating portrait busts for wealthy clients. Andrikos realized quite early in his career that the true secret to success in portrait sculpture lay not only in the masterful technical skill of working with marble and bronze, though that was certainly crucial. Far more important was finding models who could capture and hold the precise expression the client wished to see immortalized in stone. Most people, when asked to pose for a sculpture, became stiff and self-conscious. They tried to arrange their features into what they thought looked noble or attractive, with the result that every portrait appeared artificially posed and lifeless. But Medusa had a truly unique gift that Andrikos had never encountered before. She could remain perfectly still while maintaining a completely natural expression. Moreover, she was capable of holding various expressions for several hours at a stretch, allowing the sculptor to capture the subtle nuances of mood and personality that gave his creations a living soul. She could pose as a stern, venerable matron, or as a playful young girl, as a wise grandmother, or as a determined warrior. And each portrayal was so convincing and plausible that clients often forgot they were looking at the same model who had posed for an entirely different portrait of their neighbors. However, Medusa's true gift, the very thing that made her indispensable to Andrikos, lay in her unique ability to look directly and steadily at someone, without causing the slightest discomfort. At first glance, this might seem like an insignificant detail, but anyone who has ever tried to maintain constant eye contact during a conversation knows how challenging it can be. Most people instinctively look away, begin to fidget, or fix their attention on something behind the speaker. A prolonged, direct gaze is often perceived as intense, and sometimes even threatening. Medusa, however, could look at a person calmly and effortlessly for hours. Her gaze was full of serenity, genuine interest, and complete presence, much like someone contemplating a beautiful sunset or a captivating work of art. People under her gaze felt seen and understood, but not judged or challenged. This quality made her especially valuable for creating portraits, as clients relaxed under her attentive gaze, allowing their true characters to emerge, which Andrikos then masterfully captured in stone. This fruitful collaboration thrived for several years, until one day a client arrived who turned everything upside down. His name was Poseidon, and he presented himself as a sea captain, though something in his manner and demeanor hinted that he was accustomed to far greater authority than most ship commanders. He expressed a desire to commission his portrait bust, as he explained, as a gift for a temple he was supporting financially. The commission itself was fairly standard. Poseidon wanted to be depicted in a heroic style, strong, noble, awe-inspiring. Andrikos had created dozens of such portraits over the years, but from the very beginning, the sessions with Poseidon were marked by a palpable discomfort. Poseidon seemed far less interested in the portrait itself than in Medusa's person. He constantly interrupted the work to speak with her, ask personal questions, and hint that she might enjoy a more exciting life than simply posing for sculptures on a modest island. Medusa met these distractions with the same unperturbed professionalism she displayed in all aspects of her work. She responded politely but concisely, then refocused on maintaining the pose Andrikos needed for his creation. However, Poseidon's behavior became increasingly insistent and inappropriate with each session. He began arriving early and staying late, seeking to monopolize Medusa's time. He brought expensive gifts, which she invariably politely refused. He made offers of joint travels and opportunities he could provide her in other cities. Finally, he made his intentions perfectly clear. He wanted Medusa to leave with him, to become his companion, to abandon her quiet life for whatever adventures he could offer. When she refused, firmly but respectfully, his demeanor completely changed. The man who had presented himself as charming and generous proved to be someone who did not accept rejection gracefully. He grew angry, then began to threaten, and then, in a moment that would haunt Medusa for the rest of her life, he resorted to violence. What happened next in Andrikos's workshop was an assault that left Medusa traumatized and Poseidon feeling powerful and entitled. When it was over, he departed as if nothing significant had occurred, promising to return the next day to continue work on the portrait. But the true horror was yet to come. That same night, as Medusa tried to process what had happened to her, another visitor arrived at the workshop, a woman who introduced herself as Athena, claiming to represent the temple for which Poseidon's portrait was intended. Instead of offering sympathy or support to the young woman who had been victimized, Athena heaped accusations and blame upon her. Medusa had tempted a holy man, she claimed. Medusa had used her beauty and her extraordinary gaze to entice someone who should have been focused on sacred duties. Medusa was responsible for the desecration of the temple that had occurred. The punishment Athena inflicted was cruel and precisely calculated. Medusa's beautiful hair, her pride and most distinguishing feature, would transform into a writhing mass of snakes. Her gift of comfortable, sustained eye contact would become a curse that would turn anyone who met her gaze directly into stone. She would live in isolation, feared and shunned, becoming a monster whose very presence reminded everyone of the terrible consequences of tempting the gods. But here's what the stories never tell you about the years that followed. Medusa did not become a mindless monster. She remained intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply saddened by what her life had become. She moved to a remote cave to protect others from her cursed gaze. But she did not stop thinking, remembering, or trying to understand what had happened to her. And Andrikos, shaken by what had occurred in his workshop, and outraged by the injustice of Medusa's punishment, did not abandon her. He was too old to move to her cave, but he found ways to maintain contact. He would leave supplies at her dwelling, food, blankets, materials for simple crafts that helped her pass the lonely hours. More importantly, he would leave messages, scratched onto pottery shards or carved into pieces of wood. These messages were not just practical communications. They were conversations, slowly unfolding over months and years, about art, philosophy, justice, and the nature of divine punishment. Through these exchanges, Medusa began to develop a perspective on her situation that was both tragic and profound. She had been turned into a monster not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had been the victim of a powerful man who suffered no consequences for his actions. Her punishment served not to protect justice, but to protect the reputation of gods who preferred to blame victims rather than hold their favorites accountable. But she also realized that her curse, as horrifying as it was, gave her a different kind of power. Anyone who looked directly into her eyes would turn to stone. Yes, but that meant she could protect herself in ways she never could before. No one could now assault her, threaten her, or force her to do anything against her will. The isolation was painful, but it was also a kind of freedom from the expectations and demands society placed on young women. Moreover, she began to understand that her story, the true story, not the version that depicted her as a temptress who got what she deserved, was important for other women. Through Andrikos, she began to share this story, not as a victim seeking pity, but as someone who had learned the bitter truth about power, justice, and the ways societies protect the guilty by blaming the innocent. Her messages, copied and circulated through networks of people interested in true justice, not official mythology, began to influence how some communities thought about assaults, punishments, and accountability. When Medusa was finally killed by Perseus, who came for her head as a trophy for his heroic reputation, she met her death with a calmness that surprised everyone who expected to find a raging monster. Her final message, conveyed through Andrikos to all who would listen, was simple but revolutionary. I was never the monster in this story. I was just a human blamed for someone else's choices. Remember that. When you hear tales of heroes and monsters, ask yourself, who truly held the power? Who truly made the choices and who paid the price? Years later, when people told stories of Medusa the monster, Andrikos quietly shared the true story of a young woman who was turned into a symbol of everything that was wrong with how powerful people avoided the consequences of their actions. And sometimes, very quietly, people listened and understood that the most important truths are often found not in the stories everyone knows, but in the experiences of those who lived through events that history prefers to forget. The real Medusa was a woman who could look truth in the face without flinching, who could hold difficult realities in her gaze until others were ready to see them clearly. In the end, perhaps that was the most frightening thing about her. Not that she could turn people to stone, but that she could help them see the world as it truly was, not as they preferred to imagine it. And as you drift to sleep tonight, lulled by these gentle stories of ancient wisdom and quiet truths, perhaps you can rest with the knowledge that even in the darkest tales, there are always people patiently working for understanding, for justice, for the truth that emerges when we are brave enough to listen to the voices others prefer to silence.